Hello, everyone. My name is Shiloh. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Affirming Ministries Coordinator here at Robertson Wesley United Church. Welcome to today's Affirming Reflections. I have a spicy topic today. I'm hoping to talk a little bit about pride, the history of pride, as well as the theology of pride, and some of the negative connotations around the term pride, especially within the queer community and the Christian community. So always to start, I always like to just define things and to get us a baseline. So I'm going to start with what even is pride. So pride is a positive emotional response or an attitude to something with an intimate connection to either oneself or its perceived value. Pride is often defined as the feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own achievements, as well as the achievements of those whom one is closely associated with, or even just the qualities or possessions that are widely admired. Philosopher Richard Taylor stated that pride is the justified love of oneself, as opposed to a false pride or narcissism. Theologian and philosopher St. Augustine defined it as the love of one's own excellence. But sometimes pride is seen or viewed as corrupt, or often called a vice. So, a vice, here we have the definition of pride here. So, a feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction from one's own achievements or the achievements of those that were related to or closely in connection with. The meaning of vice, which pride is sometimes seen as, is a practice or behavior or habit that is generally considered immoral, sinful, criminal, rude, taboo, deviant, or perverted in the associated society. In more minor usages, vice can often refer to a fault, sometimes a negative characteristic trait, a defect, or just considered sometimes a bad or unhealthy habit. With the negative connotation with pride, it often refers to the foolishly or irrational corrupt sense of one's own personal value, a kind of corrupt sense of accomplishment, and sometimes it's used synonymously with the Greek term hubris, which just pretty much means offensive pride or arrogance. But sometimes pride is often viewed as a virtue. So a virtue is the moral excellence. So this is sometimes a trait or a quality that is deemed to be morally good and thus is valued as a foundation of principle and good moral being. So sometimes, in other words, it is a behavior that shows high moral status and standards, which pretty much just boils down to doing the right thing and avoiding doing the wrong thing. So we often see here that pride is seen as a vice and it's also seen as a virtue. There's a lot of different connotations with pride, either being positive or negative. Sometimes with the positive connotations, pride refers to a content self of attachment towards, our choices or other people's choices and actions. It also helps us kind of be a whole group of people, and it's often a product of praise, independent self-reflection, and just a fulfilled feeling of belonging, essentially. So, what does the Bible even say about pride, and what is pride historically seen as in the church? So, many of you are probably very familiar with the seven deadly sins. So, I'll list them up here. We have them next here. So, the seven deadly sins are also known as the seven capital sins. Is essentially just these seven, um, vices that spurred out of the Roman Catholic theology. It was first mentioned by Pope Gregory I in the 6th century and was elaborated more so in the 13th century by St. Thomas Aquinas. So the seven deadly sins are often in this order of pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, or anger, and sloth. So the Bible actually does not categorize pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth as the seven deadly sins. There's no such term in the Bible. They're often mentioned by different names in all different places and often have different definitions throughout. So the Greek word for pride is the term hubris. So this is what it looks like in the Greek here. So hubris or pride is often defined as disrespect. And in the Bible, its usage has been in such contexts of insult, injury, outrage, damage, or loss. It is often defined as dangerously corrupt selfishness and putting one's own desires, urges, wants, and whims before the welfare of other people. So, with that being said, um, there are so many different views of pride throughout Christian theology and Christian history. So we have philosophers such as Aristotle who considered pride, but not hubris, as a profound virtue. So Aristotle often saw it as kind of a way of being virtuous, of showing our pride, whereas other world religions, including Christianity, often see pride as a form of sin. We see in Judaism, pride is often called the root of all evil. It's often viewed as a virtue, as pride's one own virtuous pride or a greatness of the soul. But when it's viewed as a vice, which we see often in Judaism and Roman Catholic, it's often known to be self-idolatry, sadistic contempt, and or vanity. So theologian and philosopher Jonathan Edwards said that remember that pride is the worst viper that is in the heart, the greatest disturber of the soul's peace and sweet communion with Christ. It is the first sin that ever was and lies lowest in the foundation of Satan's whole building, and the whole most difficulty rooted out. It is the most hidden, the most secret, and deceitful of all lusts, and it often creeps in indispensably into the midst of religion and sometimes disguised as humility. So that was theologian and philosopher Jonathan Edwards in his response to what is pride. So as pride has been labeled, sometimes it's labeled as the father of all sins. It has been deemed the devil's most prominent traits, actually. C.S. Lewis, in his most famous work, Mere Christianity, if any of you have the opportunity to read that, I do highly recommend it. It shows a lot of the history of theology throughout the earliest 21st and 20th and 21st century theology. So pride, according to C.S. Lewis, is this anti-God state where the position of the ego and the self are in direct opposition to God. C.S. Lewis says that anger, greed, drunkenness, and all of that are merely flea bites in comparison. It was thought that that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice and is a complete anti-God state of mind. Even we have Dante from Dante's Inferno defined pride as love of self perverted to hatred and contempt for one's neighbor. Even if we look into the Bible of verses and texts that talk about pride, the most common areas that we see it would be in James, the book of James in the New Testament, as well as the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. So we see James 4:6 states, but he gives us more grace. That is why scripture says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. But I have my handy dandy study Bible here, which is really big. And oftentimes there are little texts and notifications underneath certain verses that show you kind of what they mean and what they're relating to. So in this verse, it relates to Proverbs 3:34. So if I flip all the way back to the Old Testament, it states here that God is talking about the verse 34 in chapter 3 of Proverbs, that he mocks proud mockers. He shows favor to the humble and oppressed. So we see that, the book of James is referring to the book of Proverbs, and all of the references of pride in the book of Proverbs have to do with arrogance, insolence, pride, and pride. But also just shows that, God is referring to proud mockers. So these are people who are proudful and boastful about their own state of pride, their own achievements, and other things like that in a very arrogant and negative way towards others. So, this is why pride is often considered a sin in very conservative Christian or even just in evangelical spaces. So, I was looking at some responses of evangelical Christian stances on pride. And so here are some of the quotes that I was able to find. One quote says, "Everything we have received from God. It is not wrong to feel good about something you have accomplished, as long as you recognize and admit that you could not have done so without Him." And Him meaning God, or at least referring to God. We even have here that another person stated, "But even this kind of pride can be a slippery slope. If we end up taking credit for what we've done instead of thanking God for helping us, pride is the deadliest of all sins because it leads to all other sins. Pride is delusional, spiteful, and bitter. In its root, it declares, 'I do not want God to be God, but rather I want to be God.'" And I personally have a really big issue with this. And for those watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the comments about, why pride is considered sinful in this scenario versus the pride that we talk about when we're referring to gay pride, LGBTQ pride, and just being proud of the hard work that we've done. A lot of the blogs and posts that I saw on evangelical Christian sites around pride, a lot of them stated that. A lot of them said, like, it's okay to be proud of the things you do, but just don't put it in front of God. And I think that is a really negative viewpoint to look at it. I feel like pride in itself, if it's healthy pride, should be upheld and it should be celebrated. I don't think that certain types of pride should be considered sinful, especially with looking into the Bible and just seeing the Greek and the context of what pride really means in the Bible. What they're referring to is arrogance. What they're referring to is being spiteful and just using pride as a way to put down others. And I think when we talk about gay pride or 2S LGBTQ plus pride, it is a different experience. So here we have, gay pride refers to, a worldwide movement and philosophy of asserting that 2S LGBTQ individuals should be proud of their sexual orientation and gender identity. 2S LGBTQ plus pride advocates work for equal rights and beliefs. For LGBTQ people, the movement has three main premises. The first one being that people should be proud of their sexual orientation and gender identity. The second being that sexual diversity is a gift. And third, that sexual orientation and gender identity are inherent and cannot be intentionally altered. So the word pride in this case is used as an antonym for shame. Shame is the unpleasant, self-conscious emotion typically associated with a negative evaluation of the self. This withdrawal of motivations and the feeling of distress, exposure, mistrust, powerlessness, and worthlessness. Pride, in this sense, is an affirmation of one's whole self and the community as a whole. So, pride, in this sense, is no longer a motivation of being negative, being spiteful, being negative, but rather pride in the sense of queer pride is rather the opposite of oneself and being affirmed in the identities that we have. The modern gay pride movement, as it once called, began after the Stonewall riots of the late 1960s. In June of 1970, the first Pride in the United States was commemorated 1 year after the anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And it was nearly a week-long uprising between New York City queer community, sex workers, and youth against the police officers who raided the Stonewall Inn. In Canada, we had our first Pride movement that happened in August of 1971, demanding for more rights for gays and lesbians. So for us, when we're thinking about Pride and Pride Month, it's not about being arrogant, it's not about being boastful, it's not about putting other people down, as the Bible is referring to. The Bible is referring to the people who had power and who were doing negative things and being proud of it. Whereas here, when we're looking at queer pride and the affirmation of pride identities, this type of pride makes us feel good. It's an indication to ourselves that we are behaving in a way that is congruent with the values of our society. The pride display of the chest out, head back, and slight smile is recognizable in cultures and countries around the world. It shows a type of status and encourages and motivates others to work hard to gain the approval of others and in our communities. So, in conclusion, I just want to state that there are two types of pride. There's the hubris pride, the Greek but biblical pride of being arrogant and boastful, where one is intending to hurt others. And then there's pride. There's pride about being people, being humans, pride about being the children of God, pride of being queer, LGBTQ, people of color, indigenous, and being proud of who we truly are. And so I think that oftentimes evangelical Christians and those who are very interested in theology often mix up the two. Because, in English, we're using the same word, pride and pride. But if we look at the Greek and we look at the context, the original context of when the Bible was written and who the Bible was written for, we see that there's two types of pride. There's the celebratory pride of being who we are, and there's the arrogant pride of hurting people. And I think that during our Pride Month, we shouldn't be thinking about hubris, we shouldn't be thinking about hurting others, but rather being proud of your pride and being out and open about who you are. And I think that is truly what God intends us to be, is proud of who we are and to show others who we are. And I think that is, I guess, the groundfall of why I personally have an issue with the things such as the seven deadly sins, which don't even have any biblical merit. They're all over the place with different words and different contexts. And I think if we took time to dig a little bit deeper, we'd have a different understanding of who we are and what we want to do with pride. So I end you with that. I want to hear your thoughts on some of your experiences around pride. And if you've run into any, church preachers on the sidewalks who, say that, we're going to hell and that pride is bad and negative and that we shouldn't be happy exploring and celebrating our identities. So if you have any stories to tell, I'd love to see them in the comments. But just to remind you that happy pride, and it's okay to celebrate and be proud of your own pride. So I'm loving seeing all of the posts and all of you just showing off your pride and showing off your identities. It makes my heart very happy. Even in COVID times and even in those who are in Edmonton who are grieving the loss of pride over the last few years. I think this summer and this month for Pride Month to really take the time to self-reflect on what does pride really mean to you and how can you celebrate pride without your community? How can you internally celebrate your own pride? And yeah, so I really want you to think about that and to share some thoughts in the comments. And it's lovely chatting with you all. If you are interested, I do this type of live stream once a month on the third Monday. So the next one will be, I think, July 19th at noon. I will be here. Every Wednesday at 11 a.m. I do a Affirming Coffee Hour where you can drop in and hang out. Next Wednesday on the 23rd, or I guess not next Wednesday, but in 2 days, we won't be having Affirming Coffee Hour just because it is my birthday and I will be out of town. But we'll return back to normal programming hours on the 30th. So if you're interested in chatting, learning more, please join me for that. I am open to having coffee and hanging out. So if you want to chat, have a phone call, have a coffee meeting, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hang out and chat with you. So thank you all for joining me for this live stream. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say and enjoy the rest of your week. And I will see you soon. Take care. Bye.